Welcome back to Faith Roots and back to our What Matters series as we working through the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles. Last week we dug into the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles, and you might want to just refresh your memory by having a read back through those chapters. And what you'll see as you look through them is that you are hit with this long list of names, these family trees that tell us the story of how God's people came about and how they came to be where they were and the state that they were in at the point that the book comes together just after the exile. We saw last time that we shouldn't be put off as we look at lists of names, that in fact there's just lots of meaning, lots of truth, lots to bless us packed in to those 9 chapters. And that the writer has carefully assembled those family trees, those genealogies, in order to make a point. He's preaching a sermon, if you like. He's making application for us. That big application we saw was that God is to be trusted because God is faithful and true, even when we are not faithful. God is faithful to his own character. And that faithfulness is to him, our trust in him in response to his faithfulness to us is expressed in prayer, just as we saw with Jabez's prayer. We saw that sadly, people that seem to start well, people of strength and valor, always end well. And that some of the tribes of Israel, in fact, disappeared because although they were strong and mighty and just in battle, supplying warriors to the army, they didn't trust and depend on God in faith and in prayer. What the writer is doing is setting us up there, not just to understand why the people of Israel in general later on would be in the situation that they were in, but he's also setting us up for what will come next in the story. What will be the difference between Israel's first 2 kings, between King Saul and King David? Now, as I said last time, this takes us through history at quite a fast pace. And so I thought it would be helpful before we dig into the detail of the story where the narrative picks up in 1 Chronicles. I thought it would be helpful for us to just step back a moment and just revise that history of God's people. And in fact, God's story of God's actions in his creation. To the detail of 1 Chronicles 10, in fact the end of chapter 9, because 1 Chronicles 10 will pick up right at the end of the life of King Saul. And we want to think about how we got there. And the detail is told in the other history books, in Genesis through to Deuteronomy, the Torah, the Pentateuch, and then in Ruth and 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. And the story can be broken down as follows: that first of all, we have the kind of prehistory stuff, if you like, the stuff that gets back beyond any other written history in the world, to the era, to the ages where everybody else is reliant upon myths and fables and legends. Where we discover that the Bible actually tells us what really happened. Sorts out truth from error. It starts with creation and fall and the events that follow that. Really the first kind of sort of 11 chapters of the Bible. So we start with the good God who makes the world. He takes 6 days to create, to speak into existence light, the sun, and land divided from sea. to form from the ground animals, and to make man and woman, Adam and Eve, in his image. God places that first man and woman, Adam and Eve, in a beautiful garden called Eden, a paradise garden, protected and provided for by all of the trees of the garden. God limits them. It sets boundaries, sets rules so that they know that they are dependent on Him for provision and protection. And it says there's one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You're not to eat from that. When you eat from that, you will surely die on that very day. They're tempted by a serpent. I think because you look at the rest of the Bible, you discover that the serpent is in fact Satan taking on animal form. It tells them that if they eat the fruit, they will become like God. And so Eve first, and then Adam, they eat the fruit. God comes and brings judgment. Death does come. Physical death will come later, but there's already death in that they special relationship with God. That they realize that they're naked, they discover shame, and they are exiled from the garden. Because they die, and death comes because sin brings death through murder. Their eldest son Cain murders his younger brother Abel. This leads to Cain's line, Cain's descendants becoming really the ungodly descendants. A third son, Seth, replaces Abel and provides godly descendants. But there's intermarrying, intermingling. I personally believe that's what Genesis 6 at the start is about, that there are other interpretations. The sons of God see and take the daughters of Adam. Looks and sees that people who were told to fill and subdue the earth had filled it. They've subdued it, but they filled it not with God's goodness, but with evil and wickedness. So God sends judgment in the form of a flood. There is decreation after creation, but one man, Noah, is found to be righteous, found to be faithful, finds favor with God, and God saves him, tells him to build a big boat, a barge-like floating object, an ark. And into that ark for protection, Noah takes his own family and 2 of every animal. And there's 40 nights and 40 days of rain. The floodwaters rise. Everything on the earth apart from Noah and those in the ark with him destroyed. And the floodwaters retreat. The ark rests on the mountaintop on dry ground. Noah builds an altar and sacrifices to God, and God makes a covenant with him, that covenant that he will bless the earth, that creation will come under Noah's rule again, and that covenant is sealed with God's sign, God's symbol, a bow, a rainbow in the sky. But after the flood, we see that the problem of sin is not dealt with. First of all, Noah gets himself into a humiliating situation. He gets drunk. Produce of the land, he has a vineyard. His son, Ham, instead of following God's pattern of covering Noah's shame, Noah's nakedness, tells his brothers there's a bit of gossip and mockery. Brother Japheth seek to cover and protect their dad from shame. And this leads to Noah cursing Ham and his descendants and blessing Shem and his. One of the later descendants of Shem is a man called Abraham, and we'll come to him shortly. But again, we see the problem, particularly through Ham's descendants, of sin and rebellion. The people that descend from them don't want to spread out and fill the earth, and so they attempt to build a great city and a tower, a temple, up to the heavens to demonstrate their power, to make a name for themselves, either to reach up to the gods so that they can become like the gods, or in some kind of arrogance in belief that the gods need a way to help them come down. God comes and scatters them, confuses their languages. And the name of the place becomes Babel, or later Babylon. Babel means in in Babylonian, in Chaldean, Babel, that word that gives us Babylon has the idea of being the gateway to the gods. But in Hebrew, it has the idea of what we call Babel, or confusion today. So there we have the creation and fall story that sets us up for what comes next. In Genesis 12, we have the story of this man, Abraham, called to go to a land that God promises him. And so the theme through the Old Testament is of God speaking blessing to his people by giving them a place, a land to live in. God gives Abraham and his descendants, the patriarchs, the founding fathers, this land. It's the land of Canaan. Canaan is one of the descendants, the son of Ham, and the tribe, the people, the nation of the Canaanites are their descendants. So here we're seeing that end of the flood narrative, Genesis 9, fulfilled as the Canaanites become the cursed servants of Shem's descendants. Abraham settles in the land, doesn't become his own possession, his own kingdom at that point. What he has in terms of his own is actually a graveyard, a plot to bury his family. God promises Abraham not just land, but descendants and nation to fill and subdue this land. Abraham's wife Sarah is barren. She is unable to have children. They're getting old. Abraham tries different things, so he takes the slave girl of Sarah, called Hagar, and he sleeps with her. She has a son called Ishmael. Some of the descendants of Ishmael will become the nations around Israel, and some of the enemies of Israel as well. Then God gives Abraham a son, Isaac, a miraculous gift of a son in his old age through Sarah, the son of the promise. Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau is also sometimes known as Edom, and we see his family tree in the book of Chronicles. But Esau, though the oldest of the two twins, gives up his birthright to be the one who receives the blessing and becomes the head of the family and the heir. His younger brother sells it for just a pot of stew. So Jacob tricks his brother Esau, or Edom, into giving him his birthright, giving him the blessing of being the heir. Jacob is a trickster, a bit of a con merchant. Esau is angry about this. He wants to kill Jacob. Jacob flees to his uncle Laban, back up where Abraham had spent some time up in the north. To return, when he thinks it's safe to return, he returns with 2 wives and 12 sons. Jacob, this man at night who seems to have super human strength, and he wrestles with him, and for whatever reason, neither seem to be able to win. And Jacob holds on to this man and says, "Will you bless me?" The man, Jacob says his name, Jacob. He's identifying as this cheat, as this liar. The man touches Jacob's thigh, puts his hip out of socket. He walks forever after that with a limp. And he says, "You're going to be called Israel now." He changes his name, takes away that shame of being the cheat. And Jacob, the next day realizes he's been wrestling with God. That's what his name means, that he wrestled with God and he's lived to tell the tale. Jacob, or Israel, then has these 12 sons. They become 12 tribes later. The younger son becomes his favourite, a son called Joseph. And his brothers are jealous of Joseph. Joseph has dreams that show that the others are going to bow down to him. They don't want any of that. So they kidnap him, they imprison him, they throw him into a ditch, they sell him to passing Midianites. And they take him down to Egypt, where he ends up as a slave to one of the military commanders. He then ends up in prison when he's falsely accused of attempting to rape his boss's, his owner's wife. In prison, he meets with members of the Pharaoh's government who have also ended up in prison. He interprets their dreams for them. And when the butler, the king's chief steward, is restored from prison to his position, he remembers Joseph. He needs a bit of prompting. God gives the Pharaoh dreams. Joseph is brought out of the prison, interprets the dream, says that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The Pharaoh sees that God is at work in this young man's life and has given him wisdom. So he appoints him as his prime minister, second in the kingdom, and sets him to work to ensure that the country is provided for the lean years, the 7 years of famine, by storing up grain during the years, the 7 years of plenty. Does this, Joseph does this. The famine is not just in Egypt, it's worldwide, it's all around the known world of the day. It hits Joseph's family back in Canaan. And so the brothers come down to Egypt looking for food. He recognizes them, they don't recognize him, they don't expect him to be there. He provides for them. And then eventually he encourages them to bring the rest of the family down. He reveals his identity, he forgives them, and says to them that what you meant for harm, God intended for good. So the family end up in Egypt, and they settle in the north, in the Delta region, out into lots of different estuaries. But the years pass by, and the people grow in number, and the Egyptians see this foreign nation, these refugees living in their land, and they're suspicious and frightened of them, and they forget about Joseph. And a new Pharaoh comes to power generations later, and he, afraid of the people, forgetful of God, forgetful of Joseph, seeks to wipe out, seeks to commit genocide against the people. This fails every time he tries, but he also enslaves them and gets them working on his building projects. God raises up a man called Moses. That's how we reach exile and Exodus, because God sends Moses to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh, of course, refuses. And so God sends 10 plagues, starting with turning the river Nile to blood, representing death. And the sons. God, the gods of Egypt, the Nile, the sun, all the different gods that they worship. And God is paying back to Egypt, because Egypt, in effect, has attacked, has sought to kill God's firstborn, Israel. And so their firstborn sons die. The people of Israel, at this point, are still in the land, still slaves. And on the night that final plague comes, God tells them to sacrifice a lamb, to eat it with their family, and to sprinkle the blood on their doorpost so that the angel of death will pass over. That's where we get the name Passover from. Pass over the houses. God brings them safely out. They, the barrier, the Red Sea, the Egyptian army chased behind them. Moses stretches out his staff over the sea, and the waters part, and the people come through on dry land. And then they spend 40 years as a stubborn people, not listening to God and wandering in the wilderness. God provides food for them, provides water for them, and God gives his law so that they know what it means to live in his presence. But despite the fact that God has told them to go back to the land originally promised to them, they're afraid to go in, and so they spend 40 years, a generation, die out. And Moses himself doesn't enter the land. And that generation, a man called Joshua, who takes over the leadership of the people, and another man called Caleb, a sort of a heroic brother in arms, go in with that next generation into the land. They conquer the land. Or God conquers the land. He goes ahead of them. He causes the walls of the city of Jericho to fall flat. He's the one that leads them into battle. And Joshua then gets towards the end of his life and he tells the people, you've got to make that choice. Trust in God. The same choice that they've been given by Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. Are you going to trust in God or not? Are you going to choose life or death? That's that constant theme through those early books. But after Joshua's death, the people become forgetful about God. They worship the gods of the nations around them. And so God sends those enemy nations in. Some of the descendants of the people we've heard about before, the descendants of Ishmael, the descendants of Esau, like the Philistines, the seagoing nation. And they come and they attack and they plunder. And every time that happens, the people remember God and they cry out to him for mercy. And God raises up heroic leaders, judges, savior figures like Gideon and Samson and Ehud. And they defeat the enemy. But then the people quickly forget God again and return to sin. Next is up to the end of the book of Judges. They're possessing the land. There's a lot going on. And the people get frustrated with the final judge, a man called Samuel, not with Samuel himself, but they see what happens, that constantly these judges are succeeded by their own children, and their children don't follow God. Samuel, we would be better off with a king like the nations around. It's going to be hereditary, let's do it formally. Samuel warns them, kings will be oppressive, will acquire wealth to themselves, won't do what they should do, will not be kind to them. But God gives them a king. This man called Saul. Saul is identified, he's described as a head and shoulders above. He's a giant, he's this tall guy. But Saul, although chosen by God and anointed by God to be king, he's a bit of a reluctant king. They find him hiding. But he takes the throne and he does some great and mighty things. He does defeat the Philistines. But there are also signs in his life that things are not quite right. On occasion, he's meant to wait for the prophet Samuel to come to offer sacrifices before they go into battle. But he offers the sacrifices himself. He also makes rash vows. So he says that anybody who eats or drinks before a battle is complete will be put to death, will be sacrificed, will die. But his son Jonathan doesn't hear that command, and he eats. And Saul has to backtrack. And when God tells Saul that when he defeats the Amalekites, that he's to completely put them all to death and to devote all of their wealth and their flocks and all of their produce to destruction, to sacrifice them, he keeps some back for himself and keeps their king as a slave, as a bargaining tool, I guess. And so Samuel says that you've disobeyed God, and the kingdom is going to be removed from you. Sends Samuel to anoint this young lad, possibly a teenager, called David. He's the youngest son of a man called Jesse, who lives in Bethlehem. And David is a shepherd. Samuel anoints him. David makes his way into the royal household to serve Saul. And this happens because his brothers are with Saul in the army fighting the Philistines. The Philistines send out their champion, their hero, their leader, a man called Goliath, who is also a giant, 9 foot tall. He's massive. And he says, why don't you send someone to represent you to fight me on your behalf? And Saul, as the giant, the man head and shoulders, the tall guy, the big hero, the champion of Israel, should have been the one to do that. But for whatever reason, he doesn't. So day and night, the Philistine champion Goliath is taunting the people. David turns up bringing food and supplies to his brothers, and he hears the taunts, and he says, why is no one going out to fight that man? What's going on? He's brought to Saul. Saul says, okay, I'm going to go out and wear my armor. By the way, I think this takes away from any image of David being this puny little child. He's a properly fully grown man and probably quite big and strong himself by this stage, given the work that he did. But the armor isn't a good fit for him. He's not used to it. He's not used to wearing armor. And he's certainly not used to wearing Saul's armor. I think Saul is trying to say to David, if you go out, you go in my place, you represent me. Represent the Lord, and I'm going to fight on behalf of the people, but I'm not representing you, Saul. So he goes out just with his shepherd's equipment, a sling, 5 stones, he just needs the one of them, and sling, the slingshot, he knocks Goliath to the ground and chops off his head, and the Philistines flee. David is brought into Saul's court. He's also discovered to be a harpist. Saul has been plagued by this unclean spirit that causes illness and distress. And David's playing of the harp soothes him. But he also goes out to fight for Goliath. Fight for Saul. The people start to sing his praises more than Saul. Saul has killed thousands, but David is tens of thousands. And this makes Saul jealous. Saul tries to kill David, and David has to flee. He's on the run from Saul. Whilst David is on the run, the Philistines come to attack again. Samuel's died by this stage, and Saul is aware that he is not hearing from God. So he goes and he finds a witch, somebody who has a reported ability to conjure up dead spirits, probably a con merchant or possibly even someone who's communing with evil spirits. Saul was meant to have removed all of the witches and mediums, all those that practiced occultic type things from the land. But obviously he still left some behind, an echo of his failure to deal with the Amalekites. He finds the witch of Endor and to summon up Samuel. Her reaction when this spirit comes up suggests that for whatever reason, God does allow Samuel to speak to Saul one last time from beyond the grave. But he only speaks to bring judgment. That's where we are brought up to. That is where we will join the story in 1 Chronicles, at the end of chapter 9 and into chapter 10, as the Israelites go into battle against the Philistines. More next week, but what I want to do here is just to remind us again that that big picture is very much the same as what we've seen in 1 Chronicles, that the same conclusion is being drawn. 1 Chronicles makes it explicit. Is a promise keeping, covenant making God who is faithful. And his people need to trust in him and depend on him. Do things go well? Sadly, they are forgetful and fail, and even strong, mighty leaders do, consequences follow. Just to think about how we apply that Bible story. Join us next week for more detail.